which allows me now to bring to you my two special guests. So we've got Dan Morrow. This is the first time Dan and I have had a face-to-face conversation, but I feel in this strange interconnected social media world that I know him really well. Dan made contact through in various ways, especially linked to the Working Class book, I believe, which I think was a significant book for him when that came out a couple of years ago. And then we sort of been communicating ever since. And I asked him to come along to this session because I wanted his perspective on early years. And then when I mentioned that I was going to speak to Ruth about it was like, wow, that's great. Ruth is fantastic. And Ruth and I are working anyway. So serendipitously, I brought people who are working together anyway in the virtual world and in the real world before and hopefully going back. And Ruth is independent thinking. There are, I don't know, I'll lose track, about 50 associates. So just practitioners, like I say, who we give a platform to. And we're always on the lookout for wonderful new people and people who can fill some of the gaps we've got. And while we have primary head teachers and primary specialists, somebody who is an early years guru, and I know, Ruth, there's more than just early years, but somebody who is an early years guru is a gap worth filling. And everybody that we spoke to said how important Ruth's work is, including Dan, with regard to early years, as well as the overview of primary education. So those are our two guests. Where do we start? I'm not an early years specialist, and one of our associates, Dave Harris, set up a through school, which meant for the first time going into an infant school, and he wrote a blog for us years ago, and it was, "You've never known fear until you've done a year one assembly." Where do we start with early years when it comes to explaining the world at the moment? Ruth, go first.
That's a very big question. I think we have to start with children's understanding and start from where they are, so children, I think when they start to come back to school, whenever that may be, they will start to talk to us about it in their own ways. Some will be ready to talk straight away, some won't be ready to talk, but they will do things through their play and show us things that will show us that actually it's bound to have affected them. So I think we have to start from their perspective. Where's their understanding? How much of that do they know about what's been going on? And that will vary. So some children will be very aware and will have seen the news and there'll be conversations happening at home. Other children will be less aware. They'll know that something very different has happened because this is not normal. But their level of understanding will be very, very varied. So I think it's about finding out where they are and being honest with children. So you can be honest without being brutally so. And talking about, yes, there is something out there. It's a nasty bug. All children can relate to bugs. Most children have been ill at some point in their life and they can relate to that. And that's where I would start. I'd start having a conversation about this, how we, I was talking the other day about how we would, almost turn our hands into superhero hands, where we would, wash with the super soap to get away the venomous virus kind of thing, and really sort of pushing that idea away that, this is insurmountable, because what we don't want children to feel is that, this is something that they can't do anything about, and that they, we want to be giving them an awareness without giving them too much fear. There's a very fine line to be trodden.
Okay. The control bit is interesting. I'll perhaps come back to that. I forgot in a breathless introduction, I forgot to say that Dan Morrow is the CEO of Woodland Academy Trust, which is a trust of primary schools. How many primary schools, Dan?
4 currently.
4 currently. So thank you for joining us. Where do you start in trying to explain the world as it is currently to young people then from your perspective in your schools?
I agree with Ruth, actually. I think that one of the difficulties is with primary education, and most especially the early years, whether that's in a school setting or a wider setting. And I think we need to understand, actually, we are talking about schools, but we're talking about a whole host of nurseries, PBI settings, and really lots and lots of different settings. And therefore, the way we look at this has to be with a bit of a sector voice together, and understanding that practitioners are in multiple settings and therefore need those opportunities to have those conversations now. But going back to what Ruth was really starting with, I think the key is the temptation will be that we lead a story and that we lead what the narrative is. And actually, I think initially we're going to have to listen, because each of those children would have had a very different experience, and ultimately how they're framing, understanding and starting to process that is going to be entirely different depending on each child. if you're a child who's got multiple siblings, no access to technology, and you're in a high-rise flat at the moment, your lockdown experience compared to someone from an affluent background with a large garden and plenty of food in the cupboard and your own iPad is going to be hugely different. And so really, I think it's an understanding that every single child in our care will have had a different experience, as will their families, and therefore unpacking what that is and getting some real understanding of the individual child's voice is going to be crucial. And so I think it's going to be about tying up with the parental and carer view and making sure that we've really thought about that, as well as then looking at what the training and development is for our staff to make sure that they've got both the emotional resilience as well as the toolkit to be able to have those conversations.
Okay, and resilience is something I want to come back to as well. Still just sort of there are three questions that I'm sort of asking over the course of all these conversations, which is what now, what changed, and what next. So what now, what are the current things that are going on and the immediate things that might be going on in classrooms? What changed is, what fundamental things might have shifted in the experiences that we've had recently? And then what next is, where might we be taking education in a positive way to have got something of growth from this experience? So just still with the what now, what sorts of things across your schools have you been doing in order to stay connected to children in the early years setting, Dan?
We've obviously got a programme available in terms of for our children as well as the wider community of both supported learning opportunities, but also it's those check-ins, it's those conversations, it's the phone calls. We utilise platforms such as Google Classrooms, but I'd suggest that's sort of the technical edge of what we're talking about now. What we're talking about now is making sure that those relationships and the connection underpinning those relationships has endured. Now, because our trust serves rather socioeconomically disadvantaged areas, we are probably in a higher rate of contact than some would be as a result anyway. But ultimately, it's making sure that there's, I think in a situation like this, relationships are like rubber bands, aren't they? They stretch and they become stretched. And so all of the work we're doing now is to make sure that stretch can mean it goes back into where it should and can do going forward. And I think that's partly about the values and culture of our institutions and organizations, but it's a reference point to how everyone in education, whether they be a childminder or a CEO, is a community leader. And therefore it's about making sure, and we've made sure that we've got those connections with our community. And I know that regardless of setting or background, everyone will have been doing the same thing, which is making sure that the parents and carers we serve are okay so that their children are okay.
Are there any examples, it's part of the conversation we had yesterday, especially around special needs, where by everything being online, there was a sense that something was missing. Are there any examples of where you've gone, where you've made that connection? It hasn't just been through Zoom or through Google Hangouts or through a telephone call. Any examples that you've come across? And I'll put the same question to Ruth as well.
We've made genuinely hundreds of phone calls each and every day, and we've got a strong hit. So the children from nursery upwards are having conversations with practitioners and teachers they will recognise and know. The frequency is dependent on an assessed level of need and an assessed understanding of where that child and the family are. But ultimately, it's what I said, it's about making sure that stretch can ping back. So you keep as much focus on the relationship that was and is. And in some ways, actually, I'd say through this, we've probably deepened a number of relationships with a number of families, and potentially some of those families who have taken our support in a mixed way up till now, I think have potentially seen the true value that it has, and also why we do what we do. And potentially sometimes it's in the most trying of times when people really realise what we mean to each other.
No, that's very diplomatically put. Ruth, any examples that you've come across of schools going above and beyond to connect with our youngest children?
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously worked with schools all over the country and settings, and people really going out of their way to make sure that families know that they're not forgotten, that they're there. And I think for me personally, I found that, obviously I'm doing quite a lot of things like this, and I feel like I'm keeping a connection going with people. But for some families, they don't get to speak to anybody, and if they don't have the technology, just making that phone call and checking in and saying, how are you, is enough. And I think Dan's right. I think at first some people were a little anxious about that, and why are the school giving me a call, why don't they trust me, are they checking up on me? And now they're really appreciative of the fact that somebody is taking the time out of their day just to give them a call and say, how are things going? Is there anything that you need? You know, so just a phone call can make all the difference. I know some teachers and head teachers have been found in the streets and going and visiting families, dropping off food parcels, asking if there's anything that's needed. That's a large part of the day for, you know, particularly for leaders who are working in areas of high socioeconomic deprivation. Some leaders are literally feeding their families, you know, because the voucher thing has been a little bit complex, to say the least. Well, let's be diplomatic about that. And so heads have quite rightly said, do you know what? We can't wait for this voucher system to sort itself out. Our families are hungry now, and we need to get out and we need to feed them. So I saw, it's not a head teacher I know, but I saw a guy who'd taken out £5,000 on his credit card and spent it on food, and was putting together food parcels and walking the streets near his school to make sure that nobody went without. You know, and it's things like that. I think Dan's absolutely right. Certainly talking to the heads that I work with, there is a feeling that they're going forward, their relationships with their families will be much, much stronger because they've seen each other through the worst of times. And so some of those difficult conversations that they're having now about these next steps and opening up, parents are much more appreciative of perhaps how complex the issues are than they maybe would have been, you know, just 10 weeks ago.
Actually, one parent put it really well, I felt, when she said, you know, sometimes in the past it's felt like we've maybe been in different trenches, and this time we're in the same trench.
That's, yeah, I mean, there's a question just come in from Estelle saying learning has been more transparent than ever for parents, and they've suddenly realised just what's involved in teaching their children. Any idea where we can build on this? While we're on the subject of parents and them having an insight and the better connections and communication, better relationship between school and home, where do we take that forward?
I think from an early years perspective, it's been quite an eye-opener for some parents, just how challenging it can be to engage small children for any length of time. I mean, you learn very quickly as an early years practitioner that you need a whole host of things up your sleeve, because something that you thought was going to take, you know, probably 20 minutes, he's done within 2. And other things that you think, oh, you know, this is just a quick activity, will go on for hours. And I think, you know, at the beginning, did quite a lot of work with parents and talking about it's okay to play with your children. That will be what you need to do. And actually, I think there will be stronger bonds for some families. And again, this is very specific to different situations, different things that people find themselves in. But I do think probably a deeper understanding of just how complex learning is for young children, but also how little things that you do on a day-to-day basis make a big difference.
Dan?
I think it's a really interesting question for those exact reasons. I mean, some of our wider reflections with our own parents and carers has been, actually, to be honest, that some of them probably haven't been as bought into what we're doing in setting and why we're doing it. And so I think the openness and transparency is the start of a conversation, not the end of one. And making sure that we do education with rather than to is crucial. And I think actually for me, I think a lot of school leaders and setting leaders in this, and let's park the reasons why, have had to make a lot of their own decisions based on what the community in front of them needs, not what they're being told, not what a set of KPIs or objectives or something else to catch us out has been designed for. Instead, we are tasked with, these are your community and they need you, and therefore give exactly what that community needs. And there's been both a responsibility and a freedom in that, if I'm honest, because it means that we can actually just forget the nonsense and go to just what Ruth has said. You know, for us and our parents and our wider population, is Maslow's hierarchy: safety, security, look to those actions first, make sure the families are fed, make sure that everyone is safe, and that's where the conversation goes to. The second aspect for me, and Ruth and I have had these conversations for a long time, surely it now tells us that the breaking up of education into early years, key stage 1, key stage 2, in the way that we have sort of built curriculum around assessment is moribund. And this is an opportunity to ensure that the aspects that make the foundation stage the most important aspects of education are actually then really embedded into learning as children go through. And not just because they're now behind and they've missed out, because actually there's a lot of pedagogical good to saying that those practices of exploration and inquiry should go all of the way through learning. And I think therefore, perhaps now there is a moment where we can look at the superb practice of early years practitioners and professionals as a basis of a renewal of how we look at more formalised education, as it's stated, at Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2.
Yeah, and that's certainly something that working with your trust, Dan, we've been talking in our transition plans going forward, that actually if you look at what's got us through as leaders, as teachers, as a society through this crisis, it's been being a creative and critical thinker, it's been showing resilience, it's that motivation, that engagement, or all the stuff that basically the characteristics of effective learning, which, you know, are a fundamental part of the EYFS curriculum, and then just stop at the end of foundation stage. And actually, when I show and share those characteristics with head teachers who are perhaps not as familiar with foundation stage, quite a lot of them say to me, but these are life skills. You know, actually, if you look at those characteristics, they're what I want. For me, I want to be resilient, I want to be motivated, I want to be engaged, I want to be a critical thinker. And yes, the key skills, you know, the core subjects are important, but without being able to apply those in a skilled way to the absolute unique situation you find yourself in, they're pretty useless, really. It'll only get you so far. So I think for me, what I'd really like to see going forward is, you know, we take the characteristics, and this is certainly something that we've been doing in your schools, and think, actually, no, we're going to take these through the school. You know, this is something that children need.
Well, and think about it. How many 10-year-old kids at the moment are getting through this because of their English and maths knowledge?
Exactly. Creativity
How many of
is
us
what's
are?
coming to the, well, it's creativity coming to the fore. If you look at all the stuff on social media that people are posting, they're really going to their creative sides to give them something to focus on that is positive. And I think if ever there was a case for arts education, this lockdown has made it, you know, loud and clear. You know.
And let's actually think about that, because it's put the focus on it, but we know for the last few years, the mental health of children and adults, the well-being agenda, and the way we're starting to coalesce around what we're putting into the system and what we're seeing coming out means it does feel like a moment in time, but it also feels, for all of the hardships and loss, if something absolutely positive can come out of this that therefore frames everything that we're doing in a profession in a way that we know is much more authentically to what we want our own children to have, let alone the children of others, I think that will be something we can look back on and say, we made the very, very best of a situation that none of us ever wanted.
Talking about what happens in early years and working its way up the school system, the age range, I'm amazed how often, maybe I shouldn't be amazed, when I'm working with a school, especially if it's a through school, and this is around the world, I'll be talking about the things that I talk about for teaching and learning and creativity and thinking and all this, philosophy for children, all the stuff that I talk about. And then in the break, I'll get somebody from the early years saying, do you know what? This is what we do. You're describing the early years curriculum. This is early years pedagogy. Why can't we just do more of this? Why, if we know that we're getting it right at early years, are we not doing more of it up the system? What's blocking it, Ruth?
I think some people struggle to understand it, and I mean that in the nicest possible way. I don't mean that in a patronising way, but if you've never worked it, to the untrained eye, it can look a little bit like, well, sometimes not even organised chaos. You know, it can look a bit chaotic. It's Cathy Nutbrown who says it's easy to observe what you know, and dismiss the stuff that you don't understand. So sometimes, you know, what I see when I walk into a setting and what somebody who's not a trained early years specialist sees are two very different things, because it can look quite chaotic. And so I think there's definitely a case for people understanding that just because it doesn't look formal, it doesn't mean that it's not academic, and that our youngest children definitely learn in a very different way, and they need that experiential learning, but there is very significant learning going on. And I think, you know, I do a lot of what I call narrated visits. So we'll go into a classroom together with somebody who usually says to me, oh, I think it's good, but I'm not quite sure. So we go and have a look together, and I'll talk through and I'll narrate, this is what I'm seeing here, and do you see how the teacher is doing this and how that's moving the child's learning on? And it's a little bit of a light bulb moment when people kind of go, oh yeah, I get it now. So I would, if I could, I would ban the phrase "just play," because you hear people saying that all the time. Oh, they're just playing. Well, no, they're not just playing. Play is, for play's sake, is a purposeful thing, and we need to value it more. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there around getting people to understand that just because it doesn't look like Key Stage 2, it doesn't mean it's not academic.
The play. I had a conversation last week with a guy from Exeter University who's actually a medic, a kidney specialist, but was involved in a project to look at playful learning within a university environment. And he had all the research about the link between play and the neuroscience, the neurobiology of play, and the effect that play had on our bodies. And he says there is a growing body of research and growing body of people who are exploring the role of play in a university setting. So he was looking to me for my thunks. Could we put some thunks on, could we work in such a way, these philosophical questions where there are no rights or wrongs, which immediately allows us to play because we can't foul up. So so there's play at university level is on the agenda, and play, not just play is early years is on the agenda, and it's sort of filling that gap. I've just come off the conversation with Dave Keeling and Steph Davis about laughter and humour and the role of, and again the neuroscience and the psychology and the sociology and the neurobiology, how it all sort of fits together. So we know it works, we know it's there. It's just a question of where do we start. Well, actually, I'll go to Dan. Where do we start? To what extent in your schools? So your chief exec, Dan, your schools will do what you tell them to.
How we work.
The run at the early.
I was just laughing at that thought then, having been in your school.
Yeah, it's not how it works, is it, Ruth?
How do you get the year 6 teacher to embrace the early years approaches?
There's two things I want to say on that, because actually Ruth is spot on. And for my own journey, so I started in secondary, and I'm a Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 specialist. And I was a head teacher of a secondary school. I've been head teacher of an all-through school and a primary school. And when I took on the primary school, my first thing I did was go to a cluster with other primary heads and kind of said, what the hell is going on in early years? And they all turned around and said, oh, don't worry about it. You just let them get on with it. That's not my style. So that's when I did the practitioner course myself and became trained in it. So, I realized two things. The first is there's a really, really, and I was guilty of this myself, to be frank, in the past, there's a really unhealthy and ignorant elitist attitude towards early years practice and practitioners that I think is, quite frankly, so far from the truth. It's laughable, but it does affect policy and practice clearly. The second thing I realized was EFA's practice is probably the most like sixth form practice you can get. Because it's suddenly all about trust and planning for risk and planning for learning based around a really sort of understanding of where they are and where they're headed. And what I find most interesting, I had this exact argument last week with someone, and I won't say who, but on one hand they're looking at EPAS being its own bubble, and on another they're talking about, after COVID, doing a 2-day training with all of their heads and senior leaders where they go off and they do some bridge building and they do this and they do that, and you just think, can you not see that to galvanize your own team and to get them understanding those key skills to make them effective, that's EPAS practice in a nutshell. Just to address your question directly, there needs to be a lot more work for all Key Stage partners and people to work across in schools. But equally, again, our staff do go into our PBI settings. They work with those who aren't in school settings. And I think we've got to just look at the ecosystems within our sector and profession as opposed to our silos. And so, for example, year 6 is always, oh, they're so busy because of SATs, etc., etc. Well, let's just take it down a notch. Let's turn it into, instead, that year 6 person who is fantastic at getting some test scores will mean that those children will leave so much better ready for transition, because they've also worked across with their early years colleagues and learned some aspects of practice for the character resilience and creativity, which is going to see that child do incredibly well, potentially more so than a scaled score of 110.
Yeah, I think it's about recognizing that those characteristics underpin everything. What we know from the research is that there's a significant amount of research that shows that children who are good self-regulators at 5 actually do better not just at the end of EYFS, and sometimes not at the end of EYFS, but actually later on. So there are several studies showing that children who can self-regulate, that can put their long-term goals ahead of the short-term needs, they're resilient, they stick at things when they're tough, they're motivated, they're engaged, they're interested. They do better than the children who are better readers and writers and mathematicians at 5, because it stands to reason, really, doesn't it, that if you've got those key skills with a good teacher, you will make progress, you will do well. If you're a child who always has to be led to everything and spoon-fed everything, then what happens when somebody stops spoon-feeding you? And I think, you know, it's something that people talk about with me frequently at university level. You know, sometimes for children, that is the first time that they get to a point where actually I have got to go and do my own research and think for myself. That's quite a sweeping generalisation, I appreciate that, but I do think we have a system in the UK at the moment, and certainly in England, that forces teachers almost into that exam factory kind of idea, you know, and I've seen it with my own children where, you know, they knew, you know, how many marks they needed to get on this answer, what you need to put in it, and it becomes more about the product than the process. And we need to go back and look at that process and say, actually, what is it we're trying to get our children to be able to do? What do we want them to be like when they leave school? So yes, the clutch of qualifications, brilliant, but if they can't apply those skills and use them in a meaningful way, they're pretty useless, really, aren't they?
We had a fantastic conversation this morning with Martin Illingworth and Graham Brown-Martin around the future of schools. Martin Illingworth, one of our associates, written a book called Forget School, which was coming out before all this kicked off anyway, but it just was so relevant now, where suddenly we thought what made a school was its exam results and its Ofsted inspection, and then there were no exams and no Ofsted. So, but schools, you know, life goes on, and we've got this opportunity to re-examine. And what I think one of the phrases came up because people were repeating it on Twitter in this conversation was, well, I employ people, but I think I forget to look at their qualifications because I don't really care. It's just, you know, it's not snobbery. I just forget because I don't see them as important. And I've found that as well when I've employed people or chosen not to, because regardless of their qualification, they didn't have what was needed. With regard to, you know, sometimes teachers will ask me when I'm working with where would they start in terms of the neurological development or the baby or the child? You know, where do we start? And I think I mentioned this to you last week, Ruth. So I think you agreed with me in terms of a really good book as a starting point. Why Love Matters is one which I think is Sarah Gerhardt, I think, or Susan Gerhardt. Yeah. I've so many copies of that which I've read and then given away to people. It's such a powerful understanding of the importance of love. Yeah. And we have one of our associates, Dr. Andrew Curran, is a paediatric neurologist at Alder Hey Children's Hospital, and he wrote the little book, A Big Stuff, about the brain for us, and he talks there about the need for love, for the brain to grow effectively and healthily. It needs to be loved, and I don't see love appearing in government guidelines. So to come back to this, and also in all the research that's going on about the technical nature of teaching and learning and cognitive load and dual processing, all of that stuff is great. Where's the love in that? So why love matters, why that sort of connection works at a neurological level with babies and small children. I recommend that book, and it's not rocket science. You know, loving a child is not. We've been doing it long enough to know how to do it well.
But here's the dichotomy. Sorry, here's the dichotomy. I was just going to say
it's about humanity, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, so therefore, for us to be most effective in settings and schools, we have to, as a profession, be operating from a position of psychological safety. And that psychological safety has to be the absolute starting basis, but then how we can build, nurture, and extend that psychological safety to the children in our care, most especially those who are from backgrounds where that isn't necessarily something they've had before. Now, if we therefore accept that for us to be most effective as a profession, we need to have a position of psychological safety, then it therefore stands that the assessment, inspection, and overall structures around the profession have to build psychological safety and security for all of us, not take away from it. And what I suggest therefore going forward is a repositioning of the way that policy makers and those of us trusted to enact policy are in relationship with each other, because at the moment it doesn't feel safe when you get the Ofsted call. It doesn't feel safe when you see the new guidance. quite frankly, it just doesn't feel safe to be a sector leader in a whole host of ways at the moment, whether that be physically, morally, or spiritually. But unless we actually accept as a whole profession that we need to be feeling a lot safer than we do in order to take that sense of safety over to our children, I don't think much will change.
Yeah, I think people are afraid to take risks sometimes because there is a fear, you know, that actually one inspector that, you know, doesn't like what it is that you're doing can have a significant impact. And I speak as somebody who's inspected myself, so you know, it's a challenge to make it a human process, and it should be. I really feel that inspection should be a dialogue. It should be a conversation. It should be professional. It should be challenging, but there should be an element of trust. And I think where inspectors get it right, that is brilliant. And, you know, obviously working in school improvement, I see that from the other side, and I see some fantastic inspectors who work with those head teachers when they're in their settings and schools. But that element of fear is always there. You know, when that call comes through, even if you're really experienced, your heart, you know, sort of drops to your stomach, and there's that, oh my goodness, I hope this is going to be fair. And I wonder if going forward we need to talk more and have more dialogue between the sector and the inspectorate about what would be a fairer system, what's the best way to do this, and be genuinely doing with rather than to.
And most especially for those setting and sector leaders who are working in socioeconomically disadvantaged and deprived areas, because look at the inspection dashboards and patterns, look at where people serve, and ask again why it's so tricky to find people to serve in those areas. It's because, you know, the lifespan of leaders in disadvantaged areas is not a particularly long one, is it?
Yeah.
Talking of socioeconomically challenged areas, we're hearing a lot of talk at the moment coming from the government about the gap, and that's one of the reasons they're trying to leave the schools open so early in England, not in Wales, not in Scotland. But in England, they're saying this gap is going to get, you know, as if there wasn't a gap before, which there clearly was. Back to our book, The Working Class. What's from an early years point of view, where does the gap fit into your list? I'll ask this to Dan to begin with, your list of things that you're keeping up at night.
That's always been there, but, you know, they say gap, I say poverty. Poverty is choice. The choice is a policy issue. And I was really very happy to see some of the sound bites coming out departmentally this morning about the importance of early years education, because I'm now so looking forward to the reigniting of the Sure Start strategy to make sure that actually those gaps don't present in settings in a formalised school place, because our childminder, PVI and wider colleagues will have had the support and resources to be able to focus on the development of children from the very beginning.
Wow. And is that a possibility, you think, Sure Start being reignited? I know it was this current regime got rid of so many of it, but it was proving to be successful in most of the time from what I remember. Is it possible?
Well, I think that given where we are and the fact that significant amount of resource has been found for aspects of societal provision that we just didn't think could be funded, and it can be. So perhaps if there's the political will to prioritise ensuring that children are able to start formalised education with no gap, because any effects of socioeconomic poverty have been mitigated through provision and resource, then that would seem both a wise, sensible and progressive way forward. And far be it from me, but I cannot see why any government would fail to do that in the circumstances, especially given the rhetoric which has been emanating from them.
I think because you use the word progressive and sensible, I think that you know, I won't be holding my breath with either of those two words. Ruth, the gap, what's vexing the schools with regards to gap, specifically with early years? Are they perceiving that there's a gap?
I'm actually thrilled to see people talking about this. People who previously haven't had any issue at all with you know, cutting benefits and, you know, cutting provision and school budgets suddenly are really driven to remove this gap. And I think Dan's absolutely right. The gap isn't, you know, it's not schools, it's poverty. And, you know, we can only do so much. I think probably what this situation has revealed is just how much schools do.
Absolutely.
Because actually, it hasn't been just about education. It's been about feeding families, supporting families, mental well-being, safeguarding, all of that wrapped up in the school package. And I've seen this over the course of the last 6 years working in the advisory service, that things that as a head teacher I used to get from my local authority as part of a package, increasingly being cut. And that's not because of the local authorities, they're having their budgets cut. And so things are increasingly falling to head teachers and MAT leaders and CEOs to provide. And that is a real strain in some communities because there is so much and it almost feels like it's insurmountable. And I think leaders do a fantastic job of putting a sticking plaster on what is a very big gaping wound. For me, the gap, I have a bit of an issue with this whole deficit discourse around children. I think, yes, you know, I'm not going to deny and say that if you grow up in poverty, there will be things that you will not experience. And I particularly think it's often an experience gap rather than a vocabulary gap. I think, you know, you need to have those experiences to talk about those things. So, you know, and I certainly felt that when I went to university, I felt quite out of my depth because people had got experiences that I just never had. And, you know, you can find yourself shying away from certain conversations because you don't want to make a fool of yourself because you think, I have no idea what they're talking about. That's way beyond my area of expertise. And that starts early. That starts with our very youngest children. So things like Sure Start, absolutely brilliant for providing those experiences and also for giving parents confidence. You know, that's probably the biggest thing. I was lucky to be ahead with a school with 2 children's centres attached. And what I saw was, you know, some things that on the surface, again, a little bit like early years, didn't look particularly challenging, you know, baby groups, stay and play, drop-in, but it was that feeling of community and you're part of the team and there's somebody there who can help you. And maybe if you pop into the drop-in, you know, it might be that you might have the confidence to ask a question that, you know, some of the parents that we work with got their first qualifications through doing work that had come about as part of Sure Start. And, you know, even some simple things like come along to a pamper session, have your nails done, and then all of a sudden the end result of that over a long period of time is we've got a qualification and now for the first time ever I'm going out to get a job that I've always wanted to do, you know. So I think some of the stuff, I think the problem with Sure Start is some of the stuff people just couldn't measure it in the same way that the bean counters like to measure it. Some of that was not as easy to measure, but really, really important.
Okay. One other, there's a question come through about the gap, and I love Dan's idea, or Dan's quote that I don't see gap, I see poverty, and poverty is a choice. And you think poverty is a choice? Whose choice? Yeah, it's a political choice. But the political model that we have at the moment is that it's the choice of the people suffering the poverty. They're making bad life choices. They've got a flat screen TV and they smoke rather than giving their children. And it's so much more than that. Poverty is a choice, but it's not their choice. There's a societal issue and a governmental issue going on there. One of the questions, surely the key issue about the gap is the significantly increased gap being caused by difference in homeschooling over these months. Now, I've seen people arguing that, yes, poorer children will have less homeschooling, might not have access to a computer, or there might be one phone between 6 people in the family, or the parents might not be involved or engaged. But then I've also seen people from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds blogging, arguing that don't assume just because we're from a poorer background that we're not going to be looking after our children just as well. So how would you argue with people like anonymous attendee there saying, surely the key issue is the difference in homeschooling over these months? Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you think? Ruth? Go on then, Dan. Go on then, Dan.
I think that it goes back to what I said, which is there are a million lockdown stories out there. And on the sort of macro level, you can make some sweeping statements and some generalizations. But like most things, when they suffer close examination, you see the exceptions, the untruths. And, you know, I was raised by a single parent who doesn't have any formal education and was a part-time cleaner and had her own issues when I was growing up. Well, I also got to Oxford as the first in my family to go to university, and she was the one who pushed me and gave me the opportunity to do it. So the idea that because I'm from a disadvantaged background, somehow my mum wasn't as good, absolutely not. And that narrative is irksome because it just drips of middle-class elitism. But equally, are there some truths to the fact that we have less resilience in certain aspects of our society? Yes. And why? Well, actually, because of a choice of austerity and the fact that there are many in our wider society who have spent the last 10 years being absolutely pummeled into the ground, and therefore they do not have financial resilience. And therefore, as a result of that, sometimes choices and behaviours are not exactly in line with what would be seen as best parenting, or indeed for themselves as individuals. But we, of course, won't be in a space to judge that, because you don't judge people for being in situations that they have not caused. And actually, we've all been part of that cause, haven't we? Because we have a greater stake in society in terms of our ability to find a voice. So why are we not collectively using it to represent those who don't?
The cognitive load, I mentioned cognitive load earlier with regard to the chat box and dealing with all of this. And it's a thing at the moment, people talking about the technical nature of learning, and that you and in the classroom we seem to accept cognitive load. But then I was reading, I can't remember which book I was reading, it's about poverty and the cognitive load involved in just getting through the day when you've got no money and you've got to deal with everything else, let alone then go into a school and try and learn, is huge. So it's trying to, okay, if we're going to understand cognitive load in a learning situation, let's go outside the classroom and outside the school and see it fully. Ruth, anything you want to add with regard to that?
I mean, I think it's an interesting choice of words, isn't it? Homeschooling. Because I would say home learning. And so you may have some children who may not have been schooled, and I'm going to hold my hands up and say, actually, my children haven't been schooled in a very formal way at all. So my daughter's done a little bit of the stuff that, you know, that has been sent. But a lot of our learning hasn't come from that. Our learning has come from the conversations. It's come from the work we've done together. It's come from projects that she's interested in. And quite a lot of that, I would argue, we could do, you know, we've done without actually accessing technology. We've done actually without spending too much money. A lot of it has come from conversations that we've had. And I'm just thinking about, I sometimes find it quite insulting, this whole narrative around cultural capital is quite problematic, because who decides what is the best that's been thought and said? And actually, you know, whose culture do we value? And so, as somebody who grew up in a former mining community in the middle of the miners' strike, you know, there was a very rich culture in that community in terms of, you know, I played in a brass band. We went on holiday together in bands. We were all members of the St John's Ambulance, because that's what you did, because, you know, that they were the people who saved you if you had an accident, kind of thing. And so there was this really rich culture. But, you know, we perhaps, because we didn't go to the opera and the theatre as much, does that mean that it's less worthy? And I just think it's a little problematic and a bit sweeping to say children from less affluent backgrounds will not have had as much schooling. We don't know. You have to get into the fine grain. So I think we just need to be really, really careful. I really worry about the narrative around parenting. This notion that if you're you know, poorer financially, you are a poorer parent. Well, actually, one of the best things you can give, especially with your youngest children, is time. Time and discussion. And I'm seeing this myself, I'm going to hold my hands up here, as somebody who is still working and working from home, I'm very busy. And I know lots of my friends are. And actually what they don't have is the time to spend with their children at the moment, that we're all, you know, lots of people are saying, this is great, you know. So actually you could be working. I know one family in particular where they're running 2 businesses and they've got 3 children that they are trying to homeschool, but they're also very mindful of the fact that if those businesses go under, 40 people lose their jobs. So that's a tremendous amount of pressure. So would they say they're doing the best homeschooling? You know, well, actually, no, I know they're not, because they've told me they're really worried that their children are actually probably going to be more behind than, you know, in terms of their academic stuff that they've been doing, than the child whose parents have sat at home and talked to them and read them stories. So I just think we need to be a bit careful around the narrative, and you know, not to just dismiss the doubt.
We've got eight minutes, and there's 2 things that I want to cover. One, and there's a few questions there we haven't, but some of them relate to going forward. How can we build on this? But firstly, just the going back bit in early years. Are there any, and we're not here to tell people what to do. It's not about sort of tips and advice and everything. But if you were back with an early years class, either of you, how would you be spending day one, Ruth?
I would be spending day one. First of all, I'd want to think about environment and making sure that wherever possible, there is some sort of familiarity. It is going to look very different. So prior to day one, I'd be taking photographs, I'd be sharing videos with parents. This is what it's going to look like, because otherwise that's going to be a bit of a shock. So there's a lot of preamble work before you even get to that, so that children are prepared. Day one for me would be about, we will be sitting down on the carpet together and having a bit of a chat. First of all, and I'd be listening, because they'll want to tell you, and I would be providing quite a lot of cleanable small world resources, because children need to tell their stories, and that is how they will do it. So, you know, just simple things like little people where they can create narratives. That will tell you, I'll be spending time on the floor with the children doing that. That will tell you everything that you need to know. Some children will be really forthcoming and they will relive their experiences straight away, and some people will be quiet and withdrawn. And I think I wouldn't schedule too much. It will be very much about, let's respond. So I'd have a plan, but that plan would be very loose, and it would be very much about, what are these children showing me, what do they need, and I would be responding to that as the day went on.
Lovely. Dan, what's the plan?
We've got a number of plans. When we trigger those, will obviously be up to the head teachers who are risk assessing and looking at the overall. If I were leading a class again myself, I think I'd probably, well, exactly what Ruth said, but I think it needs to sort of be said that the amount of work that would need to go into the new routines and rituals around hygiene and washing and some aspects of operation, which will be very different, have to be considered. How we can do that will be partly social stories, obviously, and a way of bringing in, but making sure that children are making the choices to keep themselves and others safe is crucial. But quite frankly, if I were leading a class, then the first thing I'd do to them is be saying, Happy September.
Yeah, happy, a key word. We can be happy in amongst all of this. Going forward.
No, the key word was September, in fairness.
I hear what I want to hear, you hear what you want to hear, fine. I'm going fairly happy I can. So I was just reading anonymous attendee has sort of bounced back, but we won't have time to sort of focus on that more, but I think we just need to unpick the idea about the gap and what is, if they're not being homeschooled, or if it's not about home learning, what are they doing instead, and is that just as valuable? But I just want to think now going forward, we've got 5 minutes. We've got let's say we've got an opportunity to make some fundamental changes, and one of those is that we have understood even more the importance of getting early years right. One of the conversations we had through independent thinking a couple of weeks ago was about, forget what we want the children to be, what do we want the adults to be like? If we get things right now in this critical, traumatic, difficult time, we're going to end up with adults who are able to deal with their lives. If we just focus on certain things that aren't about trauma and well-being, then we may be well just sending out some damage. They might have caught up academically, but maybe they're not in as good a state to deal with the rest of the world as they could have been if we'd have got it right now. So going forward, how do we get people on board to an idea where we focus on an early years type provision and work its way across? And that's at a governmental level or an NGO level or outside of the school, but also then within the school, the staff, getting the staff on board as well. Dan, do you want to go first? And then we'll come to Ruth to finish.
Well, the first thing to say on that, I think, is it's exactly that. We always talk about it as early years, but actually I think the better framing is around foundation stage and how that plays out in the early years, because actually you can have an 8 or 9-year-old child who the barrier to their learning is that they've still got gaps in the foundation stage of their development that need to be addressed. And if we start to look at it of where a child is in terms of that foundation, so do we need to go back to it? Do we need to look at it from a different lens, regardless of the age or stage a child is at? I think is a much healthier debate. And the reason being, we expect the majority of children to be able to master the concepts and be able to show ability at the foundation stage. Fine. The question we never address is, for those who haven't or aren't, what next? And then it's all just a rather tedious catch up around phonics, if I'm honest, in year 1 to make sure they pass a screening check. But that's very, very little to do with development matters and making sure they're actually ready in all of those key areas of learning to succeed in the future. And so I think we've got to look at it through the lens of foundation stage, and we constantly assess children against foundation stage if they didn't get to GLD, because we're looking at making sure that they are ready in prime and foundation areas going forward. And I think that's a really positive way of looking at actually those children being ready, because if they don't meet foundation stage, and let's be really clear about this, a lot of children are leaving year 6 to go to secondary with gaps in their foundation stage. And that, I think, is actually the crucial issue that we need to start looking at, as opposed to, did they get GLD?
So yeah, and I think
changing the language changes things. Go on, Ruth, go on, just to finish
I was just going to say GLD I find quite interesting, because it was never intended to be a measure and a metric used against schools in the same way that league table, we have the league tables, but that's what it's become. As an advisor, I know that we target schools, you know, and I mean this in the nicest possible way. We support schools more where the GLD is low because we perceive that there's an issue. But there's also a bit of a double-edged sword to that, because then it becomes this barrier and this hoop to jump through. And what happens with that is that we then work on those things that are going to get us over that hump and say, yes, we can say we've got GLD, but there will be gaps underpinning that. And I think it would be really useful if we took a more holistic approach and said, what do these children need to be able to be successful? And what they need is characteristics and prime areas, which we know are time sensitive. If you haven't got those by the time you're 7, that gets really tricky. Doesn't mean you can't get them, but it's harder. But I think also to look at what are the skills, what are the qualities that we want children to be able to have. So going forward, whatever we teach them, they are in a place to absorb that and to thrive with it and to take that knowledge further. So I do think there's a lot of work to be done there about stopping thinking about GLD as this hoop to jump through and be thinking more about what do these children actually need. And that comes back to putting the child at the heart of everything that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, we have to finish now. That's brilliant. That's a wonderful conversation. Thank you. I can see various bits and pieces appearing on the chat and people are really interested, I'm sure. If anybody wants to continue the conversation on Twitter at ITL Worldwide, or drop me an email, I can forward it on, ian@independentthinking.co.uk. www.independentthinking.com is our website. There's more information on there. There's blogs and things on there. Independentthinkingpress.com. Independent Thinking Press books are currently 30% off if you use the code CPD30. If you want the ebook, they're now 50% off because they've just got rid of the VAT on ebooks, which means we can make them a little bit cheaper. Remember, we're rattling the bucket of NHS Relief Project and Winston's Wish, or Big Issue or RSPB. Thank you so much, Ruth, for being our newest associate and for contributing so well today. Dan, thank you so much. I know you've had a bit of a tricky day, and I really appreciate you being here. And when things are better, I shall come and visit you and some of your schools. And both of you, I owe a pint or a gin and tonic too. We'll hold with that, and that means at some point we'll get to do that face to face.
We will do.
Thank you, Nina, in the background.
Thanks, Nina.
Thank you, everybody, for coming along. This will be online, all being well, technology permitting, next week. Hopefully podcast, hopefully as on YouTube as well. In the meantime, thank you and stay safe and goodbye.